Select your window, and then down in the lower right-hand corner.
Okay, there we go.
It says share. And we see your Zoom screen, but we don't see your presentation yet.
Now you should.
Very good. We are
okay.
And
Finally.
I'm ready when you are with your poll. Thank you.
Okay, so yeah, before I start kind of explain how we worked out that this is going to work, I'm going to go through the presentation, but we're going to take a couple breaks to try to make it a little bit more interactive. Like the challenge of doing this remotely is I kind of feel like I'm talking to outer space. Maybe I am, outer space and back. So what we're going to do is there is a poll that you should be able to access, and feel free to go and enter a response, and then about a third of the way through the presentation I'll stop, and I understand that Elizabeth is going to read the results of the poll, and we'll also take a few questions. And the way we'll do questions is enter a question in the chat, and then Elizabeth will select a couple of those to pose to me, and I'll answer them. And then we'll go through another third, and about 2/3 of the way through, we'll do the same thing, but with a second question. So the first question is basically, have you visited the Mediterranean region before in Europe? Here we go. And if so, in which decade, or if you've been there more than one decade, which was the first decade that you visited? And then there's the option of no, never been there. So the talk tonight is about visiting a particular special place in the Mediterranean, but the whole area is very interesting, ecologically, botanically, culturally, historically. So yeah, this will be the first question we'll ask, and let's see how the results turn out.
We're at 66%, so keep voting, folks. It's fun and exciting.
Okay.
I'll give it just 15 more seconds. If you'd like to be a part of our poll, please join in.
So I just want to kind of to give an overview. There's kind of three interwoven storylines here. One is kind of personal history, because when I was 9, our family lived on the island of Crete for a year. And oh, we got the results. Let's see, it looks like the past 10 years is the highest with 14 people, or 22%. The second is the 70s, but actually several people who visited in the 60s or 50s even. So that's pretty interesting. And so 38% no, never been there. So that means that 62%, so almost 2/3 of you have been to the Mediterranean. So that's good. That'll help kind of help you orient yourselves. Yeah, so yeah, when I was 9 years old, our family lived on the island of Crete for a year. My father was a civil engineer, and he got a job with a consulting firm there. That was right before we moved to the Seattle area. So the rest of my life, I've lived in the Pacific Northwest. So there's kind of this contrast in my memory going back to that time. And then in 2019, I went back for the first time in 50 years. And I took my daughter with me, and she had heard a lot about our family adventures when I was a child. But so this is kind of a chance to share part of that part of my life with her. So that was fun too. She was 23 at the time. Another theme that I want to kind of weave in is kind of learning about the landscape and reflecting on it based on what I know now, both botanically and really getting a better understanding of the interactions between humans and nature, humans and the landscape over time, and how those interactions sometimes are negative, sometimes are positive. And so kind of really looking in fine detail. And Crete really gives a lot of great examples of that, partly because the documented history goes back a really long ways. I'll talk about that down the road as well. What I want to do, let's see, now I need to go to the next slide. There we go. First, I want to just give you a really brief geographic orientation. We'll talk more about geography and background in a bit, but Crete is one of the 5 large islands in the Mediterranean. If you look at the bottom of the screen, there's a red arrow there that points to the island of Crete. The 5 large islands kind of going from east to west: Cyprus, Crete, Sicily, Corsica, and Sardinia. And then there's a ton of much smaller islands too. So the Mediterranean is really an area of islands, but these large islands are special because they kind of have some aspects of a continent as well from a kind of biogeographic history standpoint. So now you know where Crete is, but what I want to do is try to do a participatory exercise here, just to kind of get you in the right frame of mind. And what I'd like to do is ask you to close your eyes so you can kind of filter out any distractions around you. And I'll kind of narrate you through the process of arriving in Crete in April of 2019. And, you know, at the end of a long travel experience, and kind of what it was like for me to get to the airport, get on the road, and stop at our first stop. So close your eyes. Kind of just picture yourself, and if you've done any international travel, you know what this is like. You know, it's very tiring sitting in an airplane and going on a long flight. In our case, we stopped in London and we spent a day and a night in London, and then took a flight, nonstop flight from London to Heraklion, the large city on Crete. And by that time, you know, it's about a 10-hour time difference. We were just totally wiped out, not enough sleep, totally jet lagged. And so it's kind of a state of delirium and not quite knowing where we are. And so if you're arriving in a different country where they speak a different language and the writing is using a different alphabet, that can be a little disorienting. So kind of picture that part of it. Now, fortunately, we had signed up with a guide for the first week of our time there. And so we were met at the airport. Somebody, you know, kind of once we got through customs, we got in a van and we drove off. And so that was really great. We just didn't have to think about that part of it. And we drove westward along the north shore of the island for about an hour. After we left the city of Heraklion, going through fairly rugged terrain along the coastline where the mountains drop dramatically into the sea. And then we passed by an area where there's kind of level beaches, and then into the mountains again. And after an hour, we got to the city of RETHYMNON, which is the 3rd largest city on the island. And we turned inland there and drove for another 15 miles or so into the center of the island. And we pulled off the highway at a certain spot, a little nondescript looking. And it had been raining, light rain. It was gray and extremely green. The winter of 2018, 2019 was the rainiest winter on Crete in 50 years. You know, like probably 3 times the average rainfall. So it was extremely green. There were evidence of landslides in the mountainous areas all along the road. Where they cleaned up the landslides. Some cases they hadn't cleaned them up. So we pull off the road, and fairly nondescript area. There's a concrete building, and then a little hillside. And where we had stopped is an archaeological site. It's an ancient cemetery, a Minoan cemetery, about 3,000 years old. And people visit the site mostly to see where these tombs, which had been well preserved for 3,000 years, had been excavated, and all of the burial goods that had been found with the tombs had been moved to the local archaeological museum, so you could see the artifacts in the museum. But people also like to see the tombs and kind of imagine 3,000 years ago that, you know, the local people were burying their family members there. The reason we stopped, though, is because scattered among the tombs, there's scattered oak trees, deciduous oaks, and the grasses and wildflowers really in their peak of green and color. And so that's where we first interacted with Crete on this drizzly afternoon in April. So here's a photo of what we encountered. Scattered oak trees, kind of like a savanna or an open woodland. Various kinds of wildflowers, composites. I don't even know which species they were. They looked like Hypocris to me. Could have been Hypocris. Some other non-native species, some species that are non-native with us, like Alverson pratensis. But these pink flowers, they're orchids. And Crete is renowned for its orchids. So this is great to be able to just get right out of the car, and there they were. And there were a number of species at this site. The pink flowers in this photo, it's a species called Orchis italica. The common name is naked man orchid, and there's a reason for that. If you look at the individual flowers, which you can't see in this photo, but they look very much like the outline of a human. And not just any human, it's definitely a male human, very anatomically correct there. So that's why these are called naked man orchids. And over our time, we got to see many species of orchids, quite a few species of orchis, this genus in particular. And I'll show you more of the photos beyond. But yeah, you can just kind of picture the soft green, the new leaves emerging on the deciduous oaks. This is a species called the Wallonia oak. It's a Mediterranean species. And yeah, just this very soft, gentle landscape. Okay, well, hopefully now you've kind of immersed yourself in the place, and I'll spend a little bit of time talking about my childhood experiences while we were living there. We have a pretty good family photo archive, and so I'm able to share these with you. These are photos taken by my mother or father, really, for the most part. So we lived outside the city of Heraklion, the largest city on the island, and we rented a house actually at the top floor of a duplex. This was the view from our balcony, looking northward to the Mediterranean, past vineyards and olive groves and pastures, a really amazing bucolic setting. Off in the distance, the Mediterranean. There's an island there, and the name is Dragon Island. The reason for that is it looks like it's a dragon that's kind of laying in the sea with a head on the right end and the tail on the left end. And then actually just off the photo to the right, there's a little, much smaller island that is kind of the prey item that the dragon is going to eat. That's the view out towards the Mediterranean. In the other direction, looking inland, just a mile south of us was the Palace of Knossos. This is the famous Minoan ruin that goes back about 4,000 years. And so we could walk to Knossos if we wanted to, and we certainly spent time exploring there. We spent a good bit of time exploring the island, actually. We were interested in seeing what it was like, and did a fair amount of hiking and exploring. And so this is me and two of my sisters. My third sister wasn't born yet, but hiking up to the top of Yukos, which is a prominent peak just south of Heraklion. And on the top, there was a Minoan temple. The Minoan religion, they had these places of worship for, giving donations to the gods on the top of peaks. They were nature worshipers, basically. I wasn't really a botanist at that time, a junior botanist, but we have photos of going wildflower collecting. These are Chrysanthemum cornarium, which is a really weedy wildflower. It's not something that's rare or precious, so it's fine to pick it. This is my mom picking wildflowers. And we have these great photos of just life, of the Greek life in 1968 in the villages and cities. And I think these were taken by my mom. She really liked to capture the local color. And so these are all 50 years ago. The harbor in Heraklion, a really cool place. There's a breakwater, and partway down the breakwater, this fort in the background. It was built by the Venetians, I think, in the 15th century, and it's still there. So this kind of blending of history over time is really cool. And, just typical older Greek men. In 1968, these men would have been old enough to have been adults when the Nazi army invaded Crete and occupied the island during World War II. So they probably had a lot of memories and adventures as part of the resistance. Probably they kind of looked like resistance fighters. So yeah, just a little bit of overview and kind of the memories that are embedded in my brain. There's also kind of more subtle memories that I can talk about a bit more later. Just getting back to the background of Crete and its biogeography and ecological history. Here's kind of a map showing the terrain of the island of Crete relative to a couple other islands, and it's at a juncture of two continental plates. That's why the islands exist there. You can see that there are three major mountain areas on the island in different parts, and each of those has mountain peaks that rise over 8,000 feet. So, you know, the island's 150 miles long, in east-west direction. North-south, it's 10 to 30 miles. So these 8,000-foot peaks are no more than 15 feet from the Mediterranean, 15 miles from the Mediterranean. The land area is about 1.5 times the land area of King County, so it's not that big of an area. There are extensive areas of limestone, and I'd say most of the island really is calcareous, and that really influences the vegetation. On this inset map, the area is shown as red, or limestone. Yellow is marl, that's also calcareous, but not as mountainous. So that's, you know, like Art Krukeberg would always say, geology is destiny. So that's important to know. Now there's some really interesting fossil history on Crete, and extinct animals that are documented from the bones that have been found. There were miniature mammoths, miniature elephants on the island in the past. And basically they were able to swim from the mainland of Europe or mainland of Africa. And once they arrived on the island, there were no predators. And so there was kind of just an evolutionary advantage to being a smaller animal on an island. And so over time, they became dwarfed. 5 different species of deer, all of which are extinct, and some of them really odd looking. If you look at the one on kind of the lower right of that panel, that was maybe 2 or 3 feet tall with antlers that are just as, you know, as much taller. There were hippos, pygmy hippos on Crete. And they were more terrestrial. They weren't necessarily just hanging out in the rivers all the time, and there's not really that much water on the island anyway. There were otters that were mostly terrestrial. There was a flightless owl. So all sorts of cool animals that are now extinct. It's not quite clear why they went extinct. Maybe there's more than one reason. It's also not really quite clear when humans first arrived on the island, so that might have been part of it as well. Next, I'm going to kind of bring us back to the modern time and talk about the vegetation and flora and give you an overview of the different kinds of ecosystems on the island. And so there's a range of different ecosystems, from steppe, which is, you know, grasses and forbs, which is only in the driest parts of the island. Fragana, garrigue, and maquis, those are all shrub communities, and some ways are kind of equivalent to chaparral in California, but these shrub communities are typical of Mediterranean climates. And but also quite a bit of savanna on the island, and woodland and forest. And I'll go through and kind of show you some examples and then talk about some of the important species. This is kind of a typical view, I guess you could say. It looks, you know, of course it's April, so it's very green. There's a river that's flowing well, landscape that's well wooded. What is noteworthy here is that most of the trees in this photo are olive trees. And so it's basically an olive forest. The olive trees are cultivated. The trees are pruned and managed. They're owned by people. The olives are harvested. So that's one of the interesting aspects of this landscape. I want to talk about it more, but how there's this long history of human use, and the human activities have really become part or one with the natural landscape. Now here's another scene. This is a little bit closer to the Mediterranean. This is more of a fragana. So it's sort of low shrubs with herbaceous plants in between. And these are really species rich. Lots of different species of shrubs, tons of different species of herbaceous plants. The coastal regions are also really interesting and distinct, and there are a number of species that are restricted to the coastal zones. The clumps of leaves in the foreground are, it's called sea daffodil, and it's an autumn blooming species, and it grows on beaches like this. This is its habitat, and it's around the Mediterranean. So in the spring, you get these leaves, and then in the fall, you get flowers with no leaves, just kind of emerging miraculously from the sand. So that's another interesting aspect of Crete and the Mediterranean, is that there are quite a few bulbs that have their vegetative growth in the spring, but they flower in the fall. And so autumn is another time, a good time to visit, to see lots of interesting plants. Once you get up into the mountains, you know, more humid, higher rainfall, and actually quite a bit of snow in the winter at the higher elevations. It is more forested. There's a pine, Pinus brutia, I believe is the name, and cypress are important trees. So there are forested areas as well. And this could be, you know, in the Alps, or it could be in the North Cascades or whatever, but this particular site is in the mountains of Crete, but we're only about 10 miles as the crow flies from the Mediterranean. The botanical diversity and endemism is really an important feature of Crete. So 159 species, nearly 10% of the species are endemic, another 55 endemic subspecies. So a pretty substantial proportion of the flora is endemic. And then there's quite a few other near endemic. So they're found on Crete, but a few other nearby islands as well that they've gotten to. There's also 2 endemic vascular plant genera, which I'll talk about a little bit further down. Give you a few examples of endemic species that are really noteworthy and showy. Venus cretica, this is a legume. Here's a close-up of the flowers. They're really a nice pink color and really cool, hairy pods. And this is the only place in Europe where this genus occurs. It's mostly an Asian genus. And so that's kind of a piece of the biogeography here in Crete. We're in the southeastern extent of Europe. So a number of Asian and African species that kind of just get into Europe on Crete. I mentioned endemic genera, and this genus Petramarula is endemic to Crete. It's a monotypic genus, one species, and so it's Cretan endemic. It's in the Campanulaceae. The big caveat here is that nobody really even knows what a genus is in the Campanulaceae. So a little bit of grain of salt, but it is pretty different from any other species. Here's a close in the area. Here's a close up of the flowers. And these are pretty robust plants. They're 2 or 3 feet tall. Pretty cool. Arum creticum. It's another endemic species. We have an invasive arum here, Arum metallicum, and it also grows on Crete where it's been planted. So it's kind of a cultivated species, but we've got this wild one too that's not invasive as far as I know. And I should warn you that there are a lot of species that have the specific epithet of creticum or cretica or whatever. They aren't necessarily endemic. So just because it has this as a name doesn't mean that it's restricted to Crete. Here's a close-up of the arum. And then another really interesting species, another example of biogeography, a species of Zelkova. This is a tree in the elm family. And there are Zelkovas that are planted ornamentally here that are native to Asia. But there's this one species in Crete, Zelkova abelicea. And I really wanted to see this, so we did find a spot of it, though it hadn't leafed out yet. But it has this really cool bark, and I found a photo on iNaturalist that was taken actually just like a month after we were there that I'm borrowing here so you can see what the leaves look like. So this species is endemic to Crete. It was thought to be the only example of Zelkova in Europe until another species was found in Italy about 20 or 30 years ago. So that's an interesting example of biogeography there. I'll just go through some of the prominent native trees and shrubs in the landscape just to give you a flavor for what's there. Again, I'll start with the olive because it's such an important species and has been for Mediterranean civilizations for many millennia. In this photo, you'll see that there are some pretty gnarly old olive trees, and they all show signs of recent pruning. So that's kind of what I was talking about, how there's this fairly wild looking landscape, but it's really tended. And people come and prune these ancient olive trees, and they harvest the olives. They're owned by individuals or families, people who say are from Crete but live in Athens. They'll come to the island at harvest time to help out harvesting the olives. So it's really a part of the culture as well. Another prominent evergreen species is the Kermes oak, Quercus coccifera. And it's an evergreen oak. It looks a lot like the live oaks of California, really. It's kind of got a little bit of spiny leaf thing going on. It's a very common species, and it'll form a decent sized tree. Actually, some of the ancient trees are quite large. but it's also able to survive under really intense grazing or browsing, and it can form like a crumholz that's maintained by browsing animals like goats, and that's what you see in this inset photo. So it's a real survivor, and if the grazing pressure is released, it'll shoot up and grow tall sprouts and get to be tall enough that it then can turn into a tree and won't be grazed back down. Acer sempervirens is a native maple there. It's kind of a cool looking kind of three-lobed maple with small leaves. And Cupressus sempervirens. This is the Mediterranean cypress. And probably many of you are familiar with the cypress cultivars that are these tall, narrow, pencil-shaped trees that are planted throughout the Mediterranean. So that's a cultivar of this species. There's a close-up of the cones. But the wild trees are just more spreading, look like a regular conifer. Crete is the only place in Europe where this species grows wild, although it is also found wild in Western Asia. And the last tree I'm going to talk about is a palm tree, a native palm tree, Phoenix theophrasti. This is a close relative of the date palm. It's very rare, actually. It grows in a few places right along the shoreline on Crete, and then a few places on the shore of Turkey. And like I said, it's closely related to the date palm. Pretty cool looking. This is another one that was definitely on my list of species to see. Let's move on to some shrubs. And brooms are native to Europe, and we think of them, we kind of think of them as the enemy because we have some pretty bad invasive brooms in North America. This is Calicotomi villosa, very common and was blooming. There are other brooms on Crete too that weren't blooming yet. I don't think this one is known to be invasive. It certainly was behaving well with all of its other shrub associates. So it was good to see brooms that were behaving. There are a lot of spiny shrubs on Crete, and it's probably related to this long history of browsing, and the extinct megafauna actually may be a part of that. This is a euphorbia, a shrubby euphorbia, Acanthothamnus, that kind of forms these low rounded domes. Phlomis is a shrub in the mint family, and one of the common names for these is Jerusalem sage. This is an endemic species, Phlomis cretica. The common Jerusalem sage also grows on Crete. But these are kind of cool to see. I've seen them in gardens in the Northwest because they will grow in the Northwest. They look really out of place to me in our area, but they look right at home here. And then lastly, in the shrubs, the genus Cistus, or actually the Cistus family, is prominent in the Mediterranean. And this is one of a number of species of Cistus, the pink flowered Cistus creticus, which is I believe it is a Cretan endemic. Okay, so I'm going to stop here and take a break, take some questions. If Elizabeth has been able to go through the chat and pull out a couple of questions for me. And we have another poll for you as well. Should I do the poll first?
I'm ready with questions if you'd like to do. I just actually have a couple.
Okay, well, let's go with the questions then.
Masako asked from earlier on whether wild orchids are fragrant.
Well, I'm sure some are. I don't have a particular I don't have a very good nose, for one thing. I don't have a particular recollection of coming across any particularly fragrant ones. I would say that the genus Ophrys, which I'll talk about a bit more, they're called the bee orchids, and there's a lot of different species, and basically they've evolved to deceive bees, to think that they're a female bee. Well, they're evolved to deceive male bees, to make the bees think that they're a female bee. And they also emit pheromones, and apparently these pheromones are kind of species specific to attract a particular bee species. So certainly there are fragrances. I can say that. I can't tell you much about what I experienced though. Sorry.
Fascinating though. And then Heidi Bowen wants to know if the date palms on Crete produce edible fruit.
Well, what I read was that the fruits are edible, but the meat is very thin and the nut is the seed part of it is the same size as the seed of a cultivated date. So they're edible, but probably only as a novelty.
Okay, thank you. And then Shelley is asking, are the olive trees native or a remnant of a former forest?
Actually, that's a good question. And I was going to mention that. So there's actually 3 different aspects of olives. So there are olive trees that have been planted. Usually they're grafted, just like any fruit tree would be in an orchard would be planted. There are feral olives. So basically, olives that the seeds landed on the ground and kind of rolled downhill and found a spot to germinate and grow. And then there's also the ancestral species, the wild ancestor of cultivated olives, which is the same species, I guess. Maybe it's a different subspecies. So, around the landscape in different places, you'll see each of those 3 categories. And I believe it's the same case with figs, for example. There are figs that are wild, and I think there's some of them are escapes from cultivation, some of them are planted, some are the wild ancestor. There are pears that are wild, and I think it's kind of the same situation. So that's kind of an interesting aspect of interpreting the landscape and understanding the history.
Interesting. Then I have a question from Raylene Gold. In the Minoan Palace of Knossos, or the shrines, did you recognize any plants or flowers in the murals?
Yes. I'll mention that the oldest documented illustration of a rose flower is from Knossos. So
Wow.
of all of the documented places where roses have been illustrated, the oldest one is from Knossos. And then there's another example that I have a photo of later on in the presentation. I'll just keep it at that and I'll surprise you when we get there.
Sounds great. Well, that's all the questions I have for now. So if you'd like, we could do the poll.
Yeah, let's do the poll. So this is about food. And part of the reason I thought this might be interesting to talk about is because you've probably all heard about the Mediterranean diet. And, it's one of the healthier diets in the world. And it really actually originated from research that was done on Crete right after World War II. There's a demographer who noticed that people on Crete lived to a really old age and wondered why and looked at their diet. And so that's kind of where it came from. So the question is, pick one of these as your favorite typical Greek food item. And there's no wrong answers. It's just, see what you think. We'll see what the
So
right
people
idea
are voting. We are at 62%.
Okay.
We'll give it 15 more seconds.
I also mentioned that my daughter is a vegetarian, and so we're kind of wondering what it'd be like to be a vegetarian and traveling like that, but it turned out completely fine. She could actually live on yogurt, so that worked out really well.
All right, we'll go ahead and end the poll and share the results.
Okay, well, the winner is olives at 44%, so that's a good choice. And feta, another good choice. Yogurt was number 3. Octopus, one thing I remember from when I was a kid is seeing the fishermen whacking their octopi on a hard object to tenderize it. And for some reason, that made octopus not very appealing to me as a food item. That's a very strong memory that I have. Wild greens actually are really important. It's not just survival food, but it's really a part of the culture in the spring. The Greek term is horta. And it refers to greens, just from a wide number of species. and people pick them, and then typically they're sauteed or steamed and either eaten plain or with other things. And we're there at the right time, but we didn't get to eat any, unfortunately. But I have this picture of seeing a middle-aged woman kind of dressed for town, but walking across the hillside carrying a plastic grocery bag. She was collecting horta. That's why she was there on that hillside. And then someone else, one person answered Rocky. And so that's good. Somebody knows what Rocky is. It's one of the distilled alcoholic beverages in Greece that's made from the leftovers of winemaking, the grape skins and grape seeds. And it's basically served after meals. They'll bring a carafe to you and a little glass, and not just dinner, but lunchtime too. Everybody drinks a little glass of Rocky to help with their digestion. So, okay, great. Thanks for sharing, everybody. What I wanted to move on to next is a historical timeline, just to give you a sense of the long documented history here, and it kind of relates to a lot of the cultural changes as well. We'll start about 40,000 years ago, exact date not known, but modern humans arrived in Europe. They came from Africa and then were in the Middle East for a while. They arrived in Europe. The Neanderthals have been in Europe for a long time, but modern humans arrived about 40,000 years ago. We don't know exactly when they arrived on Crete, but there's definitely documentation of humans starting about 9,000 years ago. And that was when, kind of the Neolithic culture was spreading with agriculture and domestic livestock. And that was spreading gradually through Europe and kind of displacing the hunters and gatherers. And so the history of that kind of small scale agriculture and domestic livestock goes back at least 9,000 years on Crete. There's documentation of olive cultivation at least 4,700 years ago, and olive oil being exported to other parts of the Mediterranean. The Minoan period on Crete was 4,600 to 3,100 years ago. That's a pretty long time span. There's a decent amount known about the Minoans, but there's still a lot of mysteries, and a certain amount of what you see in the popular literature is kind of made up. So that's something you need to be careful of. Nobody knows who the Minoans really were. They weren't Greek. They were a predecessor of the Greeks. The Greeks were not in what we know as Greece now, 4,600 years ago. The classical Greek period was 2,500 to a little over 2,000 years ago. And by that time, the Greeks had kind of taken over Crete. There were still Minoans there, but things were kind of mixing. And then during Roman rule, starting a little over 2,000 years ago, the Romans came after the Greek civilization declined, and there was a lot of pirate activity. That was a big problem, and motivated the Romans to take jurisdiction over Crete. After the end of the Roman Empire, and the rise of Christianity, the Byzantine civilization based out of Constantinople, modern day Turkey. Crete was part of that civilization, and that's where really the Orthodox Christian religion became established, and that's really the current religion of most of the people on Crete. But starting about 800 years ago, there was a series of outsiders who ruled over Crete. The Venetians were the first group, and a lot of what they did is still visible on the island, and so that's kind of cool. Going, things that are 400, 500, 600 years old. But the Venetians were kicked out by the Ottomans, and so the Ottoman Turks. So Muslim civilization kind of took over, and about 350 years ago. And so actually a lot of people on Crete ended up converting to Islam. And until about 100 years ago, 110 years ago, it was very mixed, Orthodox, Christian, and Muslim. Finally, Crete became autonomous from the Ottoman Empire, sort of in the late stages of the Ottoman Empire, but didn't become part of Greece actually until 1913. So it's been just a little over 100 years that Crete has been part of Greece. And then I mentioned, you know, during World War II, the island was occupied by the Germans and there was a fierce resistance. And really there's almost like this genetic propensity to resist outside rule on Crete, very fierce, independent people. And then, you know, in the historical timeline, when my family moved to Crete 53 years ago now. So let's move into the present day and talk a little bit about my time on Crete in 2019. And this is with my daughter, Hannah. She's 23 at the time. And she likes hiking and she likes botanizing, although she's not, well, she carried around a book with her. So she got kind of overwhelmed with all the botany. She would just sit down and read in her book. And that was fine. But we had fun. Here's a map of the island. And I'm just mentioning 5 different spots that I'm going to be highlighting in the next set of photos around the island. We'll start with PHAESTOS, which is actually a Minoan ruin. Going back to Minoan times, kind of the second most important quote unquote palace on the south central part of the island. And we visited PHAESTOS in 1968. So that's when this photo was taken. And I tried to kind of recreate that same scene in 2019. Looks pretty darn similar, actually. So, you know, what you're looking at here is stonework and steps, and some reconstructed, but a lot of it is 3,000 years old. So that's kind of the amazing thing about these Minoan ruins. You can wander around and that's where people were living 3,000 years ago. You can kind of poke around in these cubby holes and see storage areas. And so on the left photo, these giant ceramic storage containers, pithoi, and you can see that they had ornamentation painted on them. This is, you know, like a 3,000-year-old piece of pottery, and that's the original art on it. There's some really amazing examples in the Archaeological Museum in Heraklion. But being the botanist, I noticed in another one of these little storage areas, there's some green growth. Those are maidenhair ferns growing wild at the base of one of the 3,000-year-old walls in the ruins of PHAESTOS. We spent about an hour or two wandering around the ruins, but after that we walked up an adjacent hillside and we had a great view of the area. The ruins of the palace are in the kind of distant center of the photo. It's kind of on a spur ridge overlooking the valley. It's a really cool spot. And we walked up to this nearby peak, and hillside just covered with amazing plants. This particular one, a borage, Echium angustifolium. Echium is another genus where we've got some pretty bad invaders in the Pacific Northwest. I don't think this particular species, but so it kind of has a bad reputation, but here it's native, so that's good. Our timing was really great to see all these amazing buttercups, Ranunculus asiaticus. It comes in a variety of color forms, but these big white globes are the typical form that we found. There's also red forms, which we saw once or twice, and yellow forms, which we didn't see at all, but found on the island. And then also mixed in with these, you can see some little spikes of bee orchids, one of the species of ophrys. There's so many species of ophrys, I didn't actually learn them. It was just too overwhelming. I did look them up. I took a bunch of photos, looked them up, and posted them on iNaturalist, and I let everybody correct my identifications. So if you go to iNaturalist, you can see the orchid photos that I posted and have been identified. A couple other cool things. Rosita lutea. This is an important dye plant, actually. So it's kind of cool to see that. And then on the right is an arum, Dracunculus vulgaris. The scale's a little bit tricky. The arum it's like 5 feet tall. This is really giant flower. This one was just opening, and typically when these are at anthesis, they are really stinky. Arums typically have a fragrance that attracts insects that typically are attracted by rotting meat. So it's the rotting meat fragrance. So that was cool. And we saw mandrake, Mandragora autumnalis, growing wild. And Hannah, being a Harry Potter fan, she was very excited to see mandrake in the wild. The little yellow thing in the center is the fruit. This blooms in autumn and winter. And so we were there in time to see fruits. And then I just thought I'd throw in this photo. This is, you could stare down at your feet and you'd see a scene like this. In the upper left, the kind of the brownish whitish flowers. There's a couple of them. Those are an orchid, the genus Serapeus. The little blue flowers in the lower center, those are scarlet pimpernel, which we have as kind of a innocent non-native species, the scarlet form. But on Crete, and I think in a lot of the Mediterranean, there's a blue form and a scarlet form, and they're equally common. Okay, let's move on to another location. The village of SPILI. We were based there for a week, and we went out for day trips. And it's a pretty cool spot. Here's a kind of a distant view of the village, perched at the base of Kedros Mountain, and there's a little gorge that goes to the gap in the ridge right behind the village. It's known for this Venetian fountain, these lion heads. I'm not sure actually how much of this fountain dates back to Venetian times. A lot of it looks like modern tile work, but anyway, it's kind of a cool link to history. And then you can be walking on a trail literally 10 minutes from the center of town and be in this wild landscape of rocks and oaks. Going downhill from the village, I'll just kind of give you an idea of what the setting is like. There are little gardens, personal gardens, and orchards. And so here's a setup. Somebody, set up some chairs and a table in their orchard with, in this case, it's either oranges or mandarins, but there are also avocados and apricots and almonds and walnuts and pears. So kind of Edenic, really. There's a blackberry related to the non-native blackberries that we have here. This is Rubus almifolius, which is actually, it's escaped from cultivation in California. I don't think we have it, or if we do, not very much. So that was always, it was always interesting to see species that are invasive with us, but native there, and see how they're behaving. Now, just a little bit further down the path, there was this rock outcrop and a quarry, and I looked really closely at the rock, and it looked to me like serpentine. So there's this serpentine outcrop right on the edge of town, and it was covered with this yellow flowered subshrub, Fumania arabica. And this is a species in the cistus family. So that was kind of cool. There are pockets of serpentine here and there around the island. I don't know actually how much research has been done on the specificity of species to serpentine. People I talked to didn't seem to know much, but it was interesting to see that there. Okay, that was our kind of domestic scene, and here is kind of the wild end of the spectrum, SAMARIA National Park, which we did as a day trip from SPILI. This is the only national park on the island of Crete. And it's a very popular tourist attraction, but we were there before the tourist season opened, so it was nice and quiet. The park was established in 1962. It is botanically and biologically important. There's some endangered species there, and they've established a micro reserve for conserving and monitoring a species of orchid, Cephalanthera cuculata. This is a relative of the phantom orchid that we have here in the Pacific Northwest. Our species has no chlorophyll. It's totally mycotrophic. The species in Europe, and there's a number of them, actually have green leaves, but white flowers. We did not see this plant. The timing wasn't right, but it's there. We know it's there. So this is a view down the SAMARIA Gorge, and it's a popular tourist attraction because there's a trail that goes down the gorge, and people hike from the end of the road here all the way down through the gorge to the Mediterranean, and they get on a boat, and a boat takes them to a bus, and then they're shuttled back to where they started. So it's kind of a famous way to explore the island. But the trail was not open yet, so we did not go there. What we did instead is we hiked up the mountainside as far as we could go until we got to the snow, up the E4 trail. This is one of the trans-European trails, and it crosses the island of Crete. So there's a real good trail network there. It's a popular spot for hiking holidays. And as we climbed, it was very early in the spring, the snow had just melted, and there were wild crocus Crocus seberi. And so these crocus are early bloomers. They're kind of like, you think of like erythronium here that bloom right after the snow melts, but crocus is in the iris family, so it's a different family, but it's the same general idea. There are a number of interesting shrubs, really spiny shrubs actually. Berberis cretica was one, but not leafed out. If we'd been there a month later, we would have seen it in full bloom. It's pretty showy. A shrubby dwarf prunus prostrata, and a shrubby astragalus, really spiny shrubby astragalus kind of thing. And so that was kind of interesting to see as well, just starting to start growth. And then up till we got to our high point, there are these amazing gnarled trees, particularly cypresses. They are a lot like the bristlecone pines in the mountains of California. You know, these amazing old, slow-growing gnarled specimens that are half dead. And supposedly some of these trees have been aged, and they're 2,000 years old. They're the oldest trees in Europe. So it's pretty cool to be able to see these as well. So, okay, and then last spot that I'm going to highlight from a botanical standpoint is medieval RETHYMNON. So we're going back in time in a way as well here. And start with this photo of the Fortezza in RETHYMNON. This was built by the Venetians to defend the city against pirates and Ottomans and things like that. And it's kind of cool because it's lit up at night. It's on a hill right above, on a peninsula above the sea. And if you look on the walls that are lit, there are these dark splotches. Those are all plants that are they're basically cliff crevice plants growing in the gaps between the blocks of rock. And it was really cool to see that because there are great patches of Petromarula pinnata growing on the old Venetian Fortezza. And so if you remember, this is the monotypic genus that's endemic to Crete. It only grows on Crete, both the genus and the species. So I thought that was really, really cool thing to come across on this ancient Venetian monument. Then on the grounds of the Fortezza, lots of wildflowers. You know, the landscape's not manicured by lawnmowers the way it is here, put it that way. So these are corn poppies and borage and yellow composite. And this is just kind of a typical thing to see around the landscape of Crete in April. The neighborhood immediately adjacent to the Fortezza is a medieval neighborhood. It's intact. Some of the buildings have been renovated, some of them haven't, but it's a very authentic medieval streetscape. We stayed in a bed and breakfast on this particular street. I measured it, it's 12 feet wide. There was actually a garbage truck that went down the street while we were there. So it's a regular street, but so that was really cool to experience. And it's not just touristy, they're regular people who live in these places. And one of the things that was interesting was looking at the plants that are growing, especially on the kind of the more derelict walls. And here's a nice bundle of ferns growing on one of the walls in medieval RETHYMNON. There's a Chilanthes acrostica, and a spleenwort, a Splenium cataract. That's the one that's kind of the pinnatifid leaves in the middle. And then the one with the small pinnules is Chilanthes. So that was fun to see, being a fern person, put it that way. And then another example of the poppy family. I really like the poppy family. There's lots of different species in the Mediterranean region. This is a species that mostly, its native habitat is near the sea, on slopes and rocky places near the sea, but it's perfectly at home at the base of a wall along the main highway that goes along the seawall, Glaucium flavum. So that was cool to see too. Okay, so it's time for another break for a few questions. If you have any questions, enter them in the chat and we'll see if Elizabeth has any to share.
I do have one question
Okay.
from Shelley. she's wondering whether, let's see if I can paraphrase this deftly, whether the endemics are thought to have evolved in Crete, or are they only found there now, but may have once had a wider distribution?
Well, there's probably some of both, but I suspect, so the Zelkova that I mentioned, you know, I'm pretty sure that's a genus that's known from the fossil record from mainland Europe. And so at least, you know, the genus was more widespread, but it's managed to survive on Crete. So it's a relic in that sense. In other cases, it's probably, you know, species have evolved in place just due to isolation, you know, geographic isolation from their nearest relatives on the mainland.
Okay. And then Tanya Loswell would like to know, what mix of plants would you put in a Western Washington or Oregon garden that might mirror a Cretan landscape?
Yeah, well, the climate in the Pacific Northwest has a lot of Mediterranean aspects to it, particularly the pattern of dry summers and wet winters. And so that's, you know, kind of different from Northern Europe. That's different from Eastern North America and the Midwest, where the winters are dry and the summers are wet and green. So there's kind of an aesthetic there of, you know, appreciating that difference in the seasons and spring and fall as it transitions. Our native ecosystems that really have similar characteristics are the native prairie and savanna habitats. And so, you know, Oregon white oak and species associated with Oregon white oak, you know, would kind of be the equivalent.
Okay, let's do one more check. I don't see any more questions right now.
Okay, great. Well, we're on the final swing here.
Let me just say one thing.
Yeah.
If you've got a question, please put it in now and I'll get to it at the end, because if everybody pauses in at the end, I won't get to everybody's questions.
Yeah, and when we do get to the end, you know, I'm happy to take as many questions as people want to stick around for as well. So we have time for as many as people have.
Right.
So I want to talk a little bit about what makes Crete such a great place to go on a botanical tour or botanical expedition. And actually, I mentioned that Hannah and I were part of a tour, and actually it was a personal tour because we were the only people who signed up. It was right when the Brexit was happening, and apparently people in Britain, in particular where this company is based, were feeling like they didn't want to leave home, like they wouldn't be able to get back home or something. So Hannah and I were the only ones who signed up. And so we had a personal tour, and that was really, really awesome. And we were able to tap into the expertise and knowledge of our guide, whose name was Fiona. She'd been visiting Crete for 30 years and had tons of information, tons of knowledge. She took us right to prime spots. So if you're thinking of going to Crete or another similar place, you know, it's a little bit more expensive than doing it on your own, but I think it's well worth it. And so one of the benefits of that is that we got to see lots of species of orchids. And here's just an example of the diversity of the bee orchid genus, Ophrys. And each one of these has evolved to attract a different species of bee, just the males, to deceive them into visiting them, thinking that they're female bees, and then carrying the pollinia away to visit another flower and leaving it behind. So the taxonomy of Ophrys is just really in flux. There's not a lot of agreement. And like I said, there are so many species, I wasn't even able to keep them straight. So kind of the nice thing about it is I just was able to appreciate them for their aesthetics. And there are bee orchids everywhere you go, you'll see them. So that was really cool. Definitely one of the highlights. But lots of other kinds of orchids as well. The genus Orchis is very species rich, and here's some examples of the genus Orchis. The naked man orchid is the one on the upper right, if you want to look in more detail. A lot of people also go there to see the bulbs, and there's lots of different bulbs. Particularly in Europe, you know, there's a lot of people who like to cultivate bulbs, and so they can go to Crete and sort of see these species in the wild. On the upper left, the red species is a species of tulip. So there's wild tulips there, so that was fun to see. Asphodels, ornithogalums, the other ones on the upper level. The bottom row, left to right, is Gagia muscari, the great hyacinth, and the lower right is an allium, species of allium. So that was pretty cool. And like I mentioned before, there are fall blooming bulbs as well. So that's a good time to go there. So, you know, there's the botanic diversity is, I guess part of what I want to make is the economic connection. There's tourism is important industry in Crete, it supports the economy. And there are a lot of people who go there to see the wildflowers, to hike the landscapes, to experience the biological diversity there. So it's important to understand, you know, how it came to be the way it is and what needs to be done to maintain it. And I'm going to try to pull everything together here by kind of talking about, and it's kind of getting into a lot of words here. Hopefully you can bear with me. There's two competing theories about the ecological history of the Mediterranean region. And the first one I'll call the theory of the ruined landscape. So that's one theory, one perspective that I'll describe in a bit. The alternate perspective is that human activities are responsible for maintaining biological diversity in the Mediterranean. So those are contrasting themes, and let's just kind of go through them and let's see what you think. So the theory of the ruined landscape says that the Mediterranean was originally densely forested and all the streams were perennial. But then the ancient Greek and Roman civilizations cut all the trees, tilled the soil. There's all this soil erosion that occurred. All that massive soil loss resulted in desertification. The forests went away. And then overgrazing by goats and sheep, but goats in particular, has prevented the forests from recovering to their original extent. How many of you have heard of that concept about the Mediterranean? It's pretty well known. There's a book here, The First Eden, you know, written by the famous David Attenborough, Sir David Attenborough. That perspective has been widely spread. The question is, where's the evidence? The evidence is in a few vague passages from ancient writers that have been interpreted in this way, but could be interpreted differently as well. It's really kind of maybe more of a Northern European perspective on the Mediterranean, expecting the Mediterranean should be more like Northern Europe, even though the climates are very different. So, you know, the alternate perspective, it's really been well elucidated by botanical historian named Oliver Rackham, and he wrote this book called The Making of the Cretan Landscape. He's looked at the data, and pollen data indicate that there were mesophytic tree species like on Crete, like alders and hornbeams that are found in Northern Europe. They were on Crete, but then they went extinct. They disappeared from the pollen record. And that happened when the climate became a bit drier about 5,000 years ago. So that was really just as the Minoan civilization was getting established. And it's kind of hard to blame that on the Greeks and the Romans. But also, you know, if you just look at the relationship between the climate and vegetation, the shrublands in the savanna, those are typical Mediterranean climates all the way around the world where they occur, like in California, in Chile, South Africa. And these places can look really parched and lifeless in the summer when it's dry. You know, especially if the goats and sheep have been through. You know, it's somewhat of a bit of perspective. It's also worth noting that the shrublands and savannas are readily adaptable for food production purposes, particularly tree crops and grazing of livestock, small scale grains, particularly on Crete because there's not a lot of fertile soil. What Rackham found when he looked at the pollen data, over the past 5,000 years, tree cover has fluctuated, but that's more of a result of either sort of fine scale climate changes, fluctuations, or economic and population factors. So population goes up, tree cover goes down, but then population declines, tree cover goes up. But there's not a long-term trend that you could say, you know, it was one way in ancient Greek and Roman times, and then it changed, and it's been that way permanently since. The other thing that's really interesting about this is that tree cover really has increased in the past century. And actually biodiversity is really high at present. I kind of look at the tree cover actually as perhaps being partly a threat to a lot of these shrub and herb species that need full sun. So that's kind of an interesting nuance there to think about as well. So here's the real question. These goats that are all over the island, you see them everywhere. You know, are they destroyers or maintainers of biodiversity? And I think we really need to kind of try to look at it objectively and really what's the history of that region? And the takeaway for me, you know, coming back to the Pacific Northwest is to look at our own landscape and what's the history of our own landscape and what are the things that we can do to kind of maintain the historic patterns, the factors that maintain that landscape. In the case of the Pacific Northwest, in a lot of places it was fire. It was fire that was partly, if not completely, set by Native people. So grazing was not really a big factor here, but fire was. Kind of the opposite, actually, in much of the Mediterranean. Also, I might mention that, you know, to me, you know, every day we'd come around a corner and come across a scene like this, and it would just feel to me like Shangri-La. This did not feel like a desertified landscape. You know, it's kind of an interesting mix of wild and cultivated. There's orchards and cultivated olives and chapels and homes. People have been living here for, you know, definitely at least 5,000 years, but it still has this wild character to it. And that's reflected and just kind of summarized by kind of some different aspects of obvious connections between plants and people. And one of them is medicinal herbs. This is a taverna we stopped at for lunch, and they just had these you know, packets of herbs, some medicinal, actually some just teas, and it was just set up for people to buy. If you needed some, you know, oregano or thyme or pennyroyal or whatever, you could pick up a package if you had forgotten to go and pick your own when it was fresh. There are some interesting and noteworthy herbs that are really highly valued. This is an endemic species of oregano, Oreganum dictamnus, that grows on cliffs mostly. And it's a really highly valued herbal plant. And it's actually being cultivated now somewhat. And so the wild populations are not really being depleted. So that's an interesting thing. And we're talking about the murals on the walls, the frescoes in Knossos. And you might take you a few seconds looking at this to really gauge what's here. But this is kind of a remnants of a fresco from Knossos. It's been slightly reconstructed. And if you look and see what it is, in the center, there's a monkey. And what the monkey is doing is it's picking things. And what it's picking is saffron. So the little flowers, which in this appear white, those are saffron flowers. And saffron, the spice, is the stigmas of a particular species of crocus flower. So this kind of, you know, it's a little bit hard to wrap your head around what they were trying to illustrate. Monkeys never were wild on Crete. This is a sign of the connection between the Minoans and the Egyptians, the ancient Egyptians, where there were monkeys. So that's where the Minoans learned about monkeys. And probably they obtained saffron from trade around the Mediterranean. But there's, yeah, these interesting aspects of the art that tell us a bit about what the culture was like and what the culture values. So this would have been, you know, 3,500 years ago that people envision, you know, the wealthy people in their homes, they wanted to have images on their walls of monkeys picking saffron. So just moving on to one last anecdote. Going back to 1968, the city of Heraklion, which we lived right outside of, it's protected by a wall all around the old city. The wall was built by the Venetians in the 16th, 17th century. And when we were there, you know, it was a little bit rumble tumble, and actually a lot of people kind of built houses on top of it and stuff like that. It was interesting to see what it looks like now. And so this is 2019. It's really been turned into a municipal green belt. And so there are recreational facilities around. This is on the outer edge of the wall. The wall itself is maybe about 100 yards wide from the inner to the outer. And this is kind of a indicator of the Venetian construction of the wall. This is a lion. It's the Lion of St. Mark. This is kind of the insignia of the Venetians. And so you see these scattered around on the wall. So this is the view on the top of the wall. And it stretches for about 4 miles from one side of the city to the other, from one shoreline to the other. And this is what it's like the entire length. It's just a sea of flowers, at least when we were there. And these are mostly chrysanthemum coronarium. I don't even know whether these are wild or whether they were seeded, but I just thought it was really cool that right in the middle of the city, there's this huge flower field. And the observation that I wanted to share, and I don't have a photo of it, but we were walking, you know, maybe a couple hundred yards behind the spot. And there was kind of a makeshift shack that somebody was obviously living in. It was like the only example of homelessness that I came across, you know, in our travels and, you know, on the island. And that was kind of an interesting thing to see, how there was so little sign of homelessness, even though, you know, the country has gone through a really major economic crisis in the past decade. Anyway, there were 2 men, middle-aged men. They were sitting on overturned plastic buckets out in front of this little shack, and they were picking chamomile flowers out of the wild green belt on top of the ancient walls of Heraklion. And they had these big 5-gallon buckets, and I presume they were just filling up their buckets and then selling the chamomile flowers is what they were picking, you know, to make a little bit of money. And just the continuity that showed over the millennia of people interacting with the native flora and the native landscape, and how that still continued. It's just part of their culture. It's never been disrupted. To me, that's something to really value. I'm not sure if the people of Crete really do. Public's being, you know, they're becoming more urbanized and fewer people living in the rural areas and kind of becoming disconnected from their native landscape. But hopefully they won't totally lose that connection. So that's where I'm going to stop. I'll move on to the next slide, just kind of a nice landscape view that we can have up. I'll take any questions that anybody might have.
I do have some questions. Melinda Bronston would like to know if most roads in Crete are paved and whether you can drive from one end of the island to the other.
Yeah, you can drive from one end of the island to the other. There's paved roads more or less continuously on the north side of the island from east to west. The south side of the island, not so much. There are sizable areas along the south side where there are no roads, but there are trails. So that's actually something that people do, is you know, utilize the trails along the shoreline. And it's, you know, you can go backpacking, or you can actually kind of just hop from village to village, or you can take a ferry from one village to another, hike some of the way and take a ferry back to where you started. So the other thing, other part of that is that the Cretans are very fond of operating bulldozers. And so there are dirt roads everywhere. And you see them just going up and down mountainsides. If you were to look at images of Crete on Google Earth and kind of zoom in, they're basically, you know, for access for shepherds. And my understanding was that the European Union is actually subsidizing the livestock owners to create these access roads. And that's kind of a weird thing that happens with agricultural subsidies. The upside of that is that it makes it really easy to access the landscape. People can go anywhere. You come up to a fence, you know, you go through the gate, you close the gate behind you, but we didn't see a single no trespassing sign. So that's an interesting aspect of it too. Very easy to get around.
Then I had several people ask if you can tell us what tour company you used.
Yeah, it's a company called Green Tours, and based in Britain, and they've been operating for 30 years. It's a pretty small scale company. The pre-tour interactions I was having, you know, it was with the owner. The owner was kind of helping me out, helped me arrange my flights and accommodations in London on our way there and back, and just really helpful. And they run lots of different kinds of tours. Actually, I don't know what they're doing right now. You know, this is a hard time to be a tour company. Some of them are pretty, you know, inexpensive. This is an inexpensive one. Some are pretty high end, you know, like if you want to go see the snow leopards in Central Asia, they'll take you there. So yeah, I definitely would recommend them for sure.
So that was Green Tours based in England.
Yeah, yeah.
And then one of the people that asked
And
that
actually, I should add that they're called Green Tours because the co-owner, Ian, his name is Ian Green.
Ah,
Yeah,
but it sounds like they have a little bit of an ecological bent.
yeah, definitely.
Louise Coulter also wanted to know, she said that in Turkey, the wild tulips were scarce due to grazing. Were wild tulips common in Greece, in Crete?
Well, it depends upon where you go. And so they were not everywhere. The example here in this photo that you're looking at, this is a species or maybe a microspecies, depending upon your taxonomic bent, but Tulipa bakeri. And it grows wild only in the Omalis Plateau. And that area is pretty intensively utilized for agriculture and grazing, and there's still some pretty good patches there. So it's hard to say what the case is in Turkey. It could also be from over collecting for horticultural purposes. That, you know, commercial collecting has been a big problem in the past. This particular tulip, bakeri, you can buy this probably at your local garden center in the fall when they have their bulb stock in. I was able to buy it here in Eugene.
Okay, then I had two people ask a similar question. Raylene Gold and Heidi Bowen wanted to know, was the time of year you went best for the orchids and other wish list plants you were looking for? Or would you recommend a different month?
Well, the challenge is that the timing really varies depending upon the, you know, the temperature and weather in the winter and spring. So, you know, it's really hard to plan for whether it be an early year or a late year, but April is a good time because if it's an early year, you'll still see lots of interesting things. If it's a late year, you'll see interesting things too. I think ours was maybe a little bit on the late side, but then also, you know, because of the elevation gradient that is there, you can kind of customize your destinations based on what's blooming at what elevation. So April is a good time to see wildflowers for sure. And it felt to me like we were there at the peak.
Good. Then Jan Bird put in a write-up about the next program, but she also says, beautiful photos, thank you.
Oh,
And
yeah. Thank
Paul
you.
Talbert says, when were goats introduced? I've heard similar arguments about cows preserving biodiversity in Ireland, but I think it is clear that the British Isles were deforested in the Bronze Age.
Yeah, so like I said earlier on, there's evidence of Neolithic agriculture starting about 10,000 years ago. And so it's believed that goats were there by that time. So that's a long time to have this grazing history. And it really kind of gave the native vegetation, just over the many millennia, there's kind of that selective pressure. So I think that might be part of it. And it can operate on a shorter time scale too. I think, further north in Europe, a similar phenomenon, but really based on what's been happening there for the last, 3,000 to 5,000 years. One interesting aspect of that goat question, the kind of the charismatic megafauna that they have on the island of Crete now, the protected species that's only found in the national park, is the Crete, and it is essentially a feral goat. So the first Neolithic people brought goats with them. Some of them went feral, became wild, and now there's this special animal that is descended from the domesticated Neolithic goats. It's kind of like that idea of, the different versions of olives. There's cultivated olives and feral olives and wild olives. And so this is kind of the feral olive version of it. So goats have been there a long time.
Okay, and then Melinda Bronston would also like to know, can you wander in the ruins at Knossos, or is it restricted?
It is somewhat restricted in Knossos. And okay, so here's one of my memories. I have a memory of wandering around Knossos with my sisters. They're younger than me, so I must have been leading them around. And we were kind of going wherever we wanted. And we kind of knew we were in places we weren't supposed to be, but nobody harassed us about it. And there's this whole, story of the maze and the Minotaur, and, that's based on Knossos, probably a myth. But so we were kind of imagining ourselves experiencing that. And going there now, we were there on a rainy weekday morning, and it felt to me like there were too many people. Large tour groups with their tablets that were telling them what to see, and the tour guide leading them around and kind of, telling this very elaborate story that's mostly made up about what each room was for and how people lived in Knossos 4,000 years ago. So there is kind of a directed way that you can go. You can't go in some of the rooms that are kind of famous parts of the ruins. You can see them, you can view them, but you can't go in them. So it is fairly restricted. If you do go there, you probably don't want to go there on a, warm, sunny weekend afternoon.
No, and then our last comment is from Heidi Bowen. Really appreciate your thoughtfulness about the relationships between people and plants, and loved your photographs.
Great, thank you. Thank you.
And then one final question that I think you might have already answered, but Louise Coulter wants to know if the pink tulips in this last slide are native to Crete.
They are native, yes. And they're a local endemic in this one plateau on the western part of the island, except that some taxonomists don't recognize them as a separate species or subspecies. So that's a bit of controversy there, but they're definitely wild in this location.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
And I think that's the end of the questions.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. This was very enjoyable. I'm a fond of the Mediterranean area myself.
Yeah. Yes, definitely something to experience.
So
okay, well, I'll stop sharing my
typically we let
screen.
people depart.